Make every night a wonderful journey, no matter where you are. Good night, sweet dreams. The first story, my first. Your first time is always the most exciting. At least, that's what Scott told me the night before he was arrested. We both knew he was going to prison for a long time. I guess I was too worked up about his case to realize my skepticism at the time. But thinking back on it, I really didn't believe him. Scott had the type of influence that could have changed the world. And then some. He just had a way with people. It seemed like no matter how bad a situation he'd get himself into, he always found a way to talk his way out of it. And although I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss him to death, it's pretty nice not having my spotlight stolen every 5 seconds. You see, Scott, in addition to being a master manipulator, was always favored by my parents and, well, pretty much the entire family as a whole. I can't really blame them though. I mean shit. He had it all. He was handsome, intelligent, and most of all, charismatic. It was no wonder people always thought him the older brother. Apparently, there was some serious genetic mutation going on with my parents' DNA during their first attempt at procreation, because I wasn't blessed with any of the traits Scott received. If I had to sum myself up in one word, it would probably be plain. With an oh-so-staggering height of 5'6", and physical features that screamed white collar, I always felt like a person that followed Scott around, just to make him look even more attractive in contrast. As you probably have guessed, I've never been good with people, females in particular. Fortunately, Scott would tell me everything I'd ever need to know. The first time I was desperate enough to ask for his advice was a little more than 2 years ago. I remember it well because it was the same date I'd gotten jumped in the school parking lot. It was that point in my life when I realized I needed a new hobby, or to meet a new person, or something. It finally dawned on me that I might as well ask Scott for advice on the one thing he had more expertise in than anything else. After all, I was pretty tired of being a virgin. I was laying on the couch with a bag of ice on my face when I heard someone enter through the side door. I immediately realized it was Scott because it was the same entrance he'd always use after going out at night. He proceeded to take off his shoes, do a double take, and stare at me all puzzled-like. What in the HEL? Don't worry about it. I cut him off harshly. I have something to ask you. Well, a few things, I stated uncomfortably. Go on then. He replied hurriedly, well, I'd like some advice on. You can pretty much tell where the conversation went from there. He went on to tell me how much of an art form it was. He explained all of the technicalities in extensive detail. It was pretty graphic stuff, but hey, I'd have to learn sometime. By the time the conversation had terminated, it was well past midnight. Welp, that about covers the fundamentals. It's getting late though, bro, so I'm gonna go fall asleep to another one of those terrible free on-demand movies. Good night, Tyler. And remember this, your first time is always the most exciting. I nodded and then proceeded to embrace sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the police had already arrived and had Scott in cuffs. I still can't believe I slept through it all. I looked at him, and for the first time, we both knew that there was no way he was talking his way out of this one. Our eyes burned into each other's for what seemed like an eternity, but we never uttered a word to each other. My parents reached for him and cried out in agony, but it was no use. They said their farewells and braced themselves for the grief that was soon to follow. I was upset for many weeks after that, and understandably so. I really couldn't seem to get him off my mind. Sleep came in the briefest of moments, comparable to the naps you take while listening to a professor's lecture. At least I wasn't alone. My entire family seemed to be in ruin. As tough as things had been for me, time was still behind the scenes, slowly tending to the wounds Scott left in his departure. It was the first week of April, nearly 2 months after the jury's verdict, when I finally decided to use the advice Scott had given me. I already had someone in mind, a girl by the name of Jennifer I'd spoken to in a coffee shop not too far from where I live. She was a beautiful brunette with blue eyes, the kind that seemed to have the capability of peeking into your soul. Luckily for me, that detail was strictly metaphorical. I actually managed to get her number a few weeks prior, but at the time I just wasn't in the mood to pursue her. My desire had practically been displaced since then due to frustrations of a very explicit nature, so I decided to call her up. I'm drawn. Hello? A curious voice responded. Hey, it's me, Tyler. We met in the coffee shop on Westbourne a few weeks ago. Do you remember me? Oh, black hair, brown eyes, and I think I recall freckles. Nope, doesn't seem to ring a bell. We continued to throw playful jabs at each other until the timing felt right and the inevitable question popped up. Do you want to go out tonight? I know a great place called Ricci's not even 45 minutes away, and even though I'm as low class as they come, I've already managed to get reservations earlier today. You're getting a little bit ahead of yourself now, aren't you? I like that, sure. Great, I'll pick you up around 6:00. Alright, don't you need my address though? Oh yeah, I completely forgot about that. 322 Hickory. I take it someone as resourceful as you doesn't need directions. She didn't know how right she was. I arrived at her door looking my absolute best, suit jacket and everything. You ready to go? I asked. She smiled and grabbed my arm. I wasn't yet ready to make eye contact, so I didn't. Not for the entire drive, as awkward as it was. I could tell that my indifference was driving her crazy. It wasn't even an hour later when she started to seem hesitant. She started asking questions about the location of Ricci's and how close we were. I ignored them all. I could sense a heavy paranoia sprouting in her as our surroundings grew more and more unfamiliar. Anxiousness had finally given way to fear. It was when she asked, "Does the restaurant even exist?" that we arrived at our destination. I looked around at the woods that seemed to engulf the tiny sedan. It was dark, eerie. The atmosphere couldn't be any more fitting for the events which were about to take place. I turned to her and said as coldly as possible, "Ricci's is about as real as your chance of survival." It was the first, and wasn't the last time I had held her gaze. My brother was right. The second story, secrets. The room could barely contain the stench of blood and sweat. Inevitability had placed its firm grasp on the remaining victim, in the form of duct tape and rope. Although gagged and bound, the boy's eyes still screamed desperation. His captor was captivated. The man pondered the boy's thoughts as he stared him down, as he had done so many times before. He relished the attentiveness he only seemed to receive in moments like this. His direct control over the boy's fate nearly brought him to a state of ecstasy. "Michael?" A hauntingly familiar voice resonated through the cellar. The man was puzzled by the voice at first, but then decided that it was probably his mind getting the best of him. Without further deliberation, he decided to finally get started and headed over to the tool rack. So many wonderful choices, the man thought to himself. The rack contained many different types of saws, hammers, chisels, and various other means for his amusement. After a quick look, he decided to go with his favorite, the rip saw. "It'll all be over soon," said the man. "It won't be long until you're with your whore of a mother in hell." The carving began. The sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping did little to mask the muffled grunts of the boy. The man spared no sentiment and instead focused his attention entirely on his work. After what seemed like only a few moments, the boy's limbs were completely severed and ready for the maniac's next step. "Michael?" There was no mistake. He definitely heard the voice again. He began to grow anxious and frustrated. This gave way to even more depraved thoughts, and the boy was sure to suffer even more because of them. The man left the room briefly and returned with a mirror, placing it directly in front of the boy. What was just slight consciousness suddenly became a gaze transfixed with horror. The man had never seen such big eyes and was very pleased. "You're welcome to leave now if you'd like, but I'd get going soon. You've lost a lot of blood." The man removed the restraints and watched as the boy flopped down onto the floor. He was greased with pain, nearly matching what he just endured. As the floor was covered with bleach powder, the boy's eyes lit up. The pain seemed to make its way through his entire body. He didn't have much time. "Michael? Michael?" the voice repeated. The man continued to block out the voice in an attempt to finish what he'd started. He proceeded to the cabinet and took out the final tool, the sledgehammer. He walked over to the boy and swung. "Michael?" The man snapped out of his trance, and his eyes immediately recognized a familiar pair just across the table. "Michael, honey, are you okay? You seemed a bit out of it." "I am fine, just did a bit of daydreaming, I guess. Just to make sure. You're still watching Chris tonight, right? I still have that meeting at 7. "Oh, sure, but I have something planned for the both of you before you leave, you know. In celebration for your new position and all." "Michael? Michael? Michael?" the voice screamed. The third story, Imaginary Friend. Click here to version of this pasta in Portuguese. The worst blind is the one who will not see. The worst blind is the one who will not see. Maybe that's the phrase that describes all this text. Now, distinguishing fact from illusion is difficult, since our brain tends to make things up. An example? Imaginary friends. Imaginary friends just entered in our culture. Everyone thinks it is normal, and even see curiosity to see a child talking to anyone presenting nothing to the others, saying that it was his imaginary friend. When you ask children to describe the imaginary friend, they speak surprise as well. Do not you see it? See how beautiful it is. Look at his wings, his tail. You surely must have heard of psychic sensitivity. At least I believe this is the name given to people who have the skills that let you do things like see spirits. The sensitivity would only be lucky few, and the population as the NVLESM. The sensitivity would be ignored. What I mean by that, you probably born in childhood, or knew someone who had psychic sensitivity, but children usually does that have to around 1 to 5 years old. Rare just managing to keep the ability for the rest of his life. Children who have it end up being averse to contact with a real person, just limited to people with whom she lives, so she talks to the air. Typically known or imaginary friend. Imaginary friends. That's the points. Supposedly things are in your head, right? Or rather, a fleeting thing, as the psychologists say. Something that children who have created their own away from their parents and no brothers or cousins they create inside your head to try to combat loneliness. The estimated life of an imaginary friend lasts up to 7 years of age, his owner. Then they are forgotten, and one known individual who ever had an imaginary friend just asking things like how to talk. The person usually does not have to give a solid answer. Just say, "I was very young, so I do not remember where he was." And when you tried to remember, it was ended only by distorting the image, that most black shape that you called friend. He became something more amiable, a bear or a giant blue astronaut jumpsuit red, and you did not care how he really was, since you will never again see him again. Is that true? The point is that you do not remember, because you not want to remember your imaginary friend was there to torment you. The games that he ordered you to do things, they were not healthy, but evil. He made you move away from other people, as I said. Only children with no siblings and friends develop imaginary friends, because I knew that if you're alone, you would have no chance, and he could feed his loneliness and his life for longer, as a parasite. Obviously, you're just a naive child, being deceived by a monster that was feeding his essence. But humans have acquired a unique skill, one thing that differs them from the animals. They can create illusions to mask what really happened. This is clear from research that appear there and prove that most of our memories are false. How is he supposed a parasitic mental? Can only be fought with this instinctive ability of the brain to relieve suffering and just pushing the dirt under the rug, and save your imaginary friend in a chest, in the confines of his skull. After that, you can go ahead and develop living the life. But what you and your brain do not know is that your imaginary friend, but apparently never has existed and has been off of his mind. He is very active, controlling you subconsciously before he was in his first stage and you could see him. Now you cannot see it, and worse, it controls you. He makes you feel angry, it makes you act violently against others. He makes you feel alone, and when you finally are alone, you will be consumed and taken to that place. You probably should not be understood why he would take so long and tormenting you stuck in your head. You could just go to hell. This is simple, only beings with souls go there. Imaginary friends are not exactly souls. Therefore, they inhabit people, filled with negative thoughts, in order to go to where it matters. Coming as stowaway show parasites, there are countless examples, but some famous cases illustrate how this happens. Kurt Cobain, for example. I still do not know if he was murdered or committed suicide. If someone planted a suicide note, he wrote it, or if they handled that. But the suicide note addressed to him is someone special, your imaginary friend. Perhaps this is already happening to you. You might not see those figures as imaginary friends, as the children describe both, for you may be just ghosts, or shadows, because your brain will probably deny something illogical, using his famous ability to deceive. Anyway, can you believe that everything I just tell you, we're simply denied everything? With affection, your imaginary friend.